discussed that once again we have to face such senseless violence in our country. May we learn to live as one. It doesn't interest me what you do for a living. I want to know what you ache for, and if you dare to dream of meeting your heart's longing. It doesn't interest me how old you are. I want to know if you'll risk looking like a fool for love and the adventure of being alive. It doesn't interest me what planets are squaring your moon. I want to know if you've touched the center of your own sorrow, if you've been opened by life's betrayals, or become shriveled and closed from fear of further pain. I want to know if you can sit with pain, mine or your own, without moving to hide it or fade it or fix it. I want to know if you can be with joy, mine or your own, if you can dance with wildness and let ecstasy fill you to the tips of your fingers and toes without cautioning us to be realistic, to be careful, to remember the limitations of being human. Doesn't interest me if the story you're telling me is true. I want to know if you can disappoint another to be true to yourself, if you can bear the accusation of betrayal and not betray your own soul. I want to know if you can see beauty even if it's not pretty every day, and if you can source your own life from its presence. I want to know if you can live with failure, yours and mine, and still stand at the edge of the lake and shout to the silver of the full moon, yes. It doesn't interest me to know where you live or how much money you have. I want to know if you can get up after the night of grief and despair, weary and bruised to the bone, and do what needs to be done to feed the children. Doesn't interest me who you know or how you came to be here. I want to know if you can stand in the center of the fire with me and not shrink back. Doesn't interest me where or what or with whom you studied. I want to know what sustains you from the inside when all else falls away. I want to know if you can be alone with yourself, and if you truly like the company you keep in the empty moments.
It's upside down. So, welcome to our minister, Reverend Jerry Kowalski.
Thank you deeply for sharing those joys and sorrows. I think these stones speak as eloquently as I might about the concerns that are gathered here in this room, in our hearts, and about our common ability to face them together, to face them with courage and hope. This is a reading from Scott Peck. Life is difficult. This is a great truth. It's one of the greatest truths. It's a great truth because once we truly see this truth, we transcend it. Once we truly know that life is difficult, once we truly understand and accept that, then life is no longer difficult, because once accepted, the fact that life is difficult no longer matters. Most don't see this truth, that life is difficult. Instead, they moan more or less incessantly about the enormity of their problems, their burdens, their difficulties, as though life were generally easy or should be easy. They voice their belief that their difficulties represent a unique kind of affliction that should not be, that somehow been especially visited on them or their families or their tribe or class or nation or race or even their species. I know about this moaning because I have done my share. Life is a series of problems, but our tendency to avoid problems and the emotional suffering inherent in them is a primary basis of human mental illness. Since most of us have a tendency to a greater or lesser degree, most of us are mentally ill to a greater or lesser degree, lacking complete mental health. Some of us will go to extraordinary lengths to avoid our problems and the suffering they cause, proceeding far afield from all that's clearly good and sensible in order to try to find an easy way out, building the most elaborate fantasies in which to live, sometimes to the total exclusion of reality. In the succinctly elegant words of Carl Jung, neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. The poet Robert Frost wrote, "Forgive, O Lord, my little jokes on thee, and I'll forgive thy great big one on me." Help us to forgive life for being difficult. Help us to forgive each other and to judge as we would be judged, not for our worst moments, but for our good intentions. Help us ask forgiveness when we've injured others and forgive ourselves when we fall short. Help us above all to forgive God, the Great Mother, the mystery of life that makes the rain to fall and the sun to shine upon the just and the unjust, that our light and our love might be poured out equally on all. To err is divine. To forgive is human. The day will come, maybe for some of you, maybe for most of you, it's already come. The day will come when your world turns upside down. 1 minute everything is revolving smoothly on its accustomed grooves, and then there comes the phone call in the night. There's been an accident. Or the routine screening turns up an unexpected cancer. Or our spouse tells us that he or she wants out of the marriage. There are 100 ways for the carefully constructed worlds we live in to fly utterly to pieces. There's only one question that really matters, writes Rabbi Harold Kushner. Why do bad things happen to good people? All other theological conversation is intellectually diverting, a little like doing the crossword puzzle in the Sunday paper, feeling very satisfied when all the words fit, but without the capacity to reach people where they really care. Virtually every meaningful conversation I've ever had with people about God or religion has either started with this question or gotten around to it before long. A few years back, the Gallup poll did a survey. They asked people in congregations what sermon topics they would like their pastors to address. At the top of the list, they asked for sermons about how to put your faith into practice, and right below that, sermons about death and dying, which is not too surprising because people naturally turn to spiritual traditions for guidance in times of suffering and loss. They look to religion for strength and heartache. They want a faith that addresses life's real problems and that does it in a practical way. Lots of you know I'm a volunteer firefighter. I'm an emergency medical responder. In the course of a typical week, I have a pager that'll go off maybe a dozen times. There's been a driver that's lost control of the car and the vehicle flips on the highway, or a resident falls down the stairs or slips in the tub, or a young woman has cut herself and tried to commit suicide, or a house fire destroys a family's prized possessions, or we do the CPR and it doesn't work. Often I'd like to offer a hug or a word of consolation, but that's not my role. I'm a firefighter, but I'm keenly aware how any day, the red trucks and the flashing lights could pull up in front of my house or my neighbor's house. None of us are immune. Bad things happen, but the question remains, why? In fact, every religion in the world has to wrestle with this riddle, and there are some good answers, but there are none that are completely satisfying. Some answer by saying that sickness and evil and death do not really exist. Bad things are illusions. God is good. The universe is just. And when life appears otherwise, it's the result of our bad thinking or incorrect perceptions. And this was the attitude of a man as great as Socrates, who said that nothing evil can befall a good man in life or in death. It's an outlook that's shared by many modern Christian scientists, by many New Age philosophers. And in some ways it's a healthy perspective because it encourages us to think positively, to stay focused on the flowers instead of the weeds, to realize that we're the ones in control of our own reactions to whatever slings and arrows might come our way. And yet, in other respects, this is an incomplete answer because loss and pain aren't fictional. Life is not always fair. Babies get born without a heart. Kindergartners get shot by guys with AK-15s. However much we might wish it otherwise, tragedy is too much a part of our experience. So why do bad things happen? Another answer is that bad things have a way of working for the good. Facing challenge and hardship makes us more resilient individuals. Experiencing pain can make us more sensitive, more empathic, more caring for the pain of others. If only we could see it. Everything has a lesson to teach, as Alexander Pope wrote. All nature is but art unknown to thee, all chance, direction, which thou canst not see, all discord, harmony, not understood, all partial evil, universal good. And I think this answer also has some merit. We can learn and grow by wrestling with adversity, maturity, and the school of hard knocks. They do bring some wisdom, some emotional insight, but again, this answer is incomplete. Some suffering builds character, but a lot of times its effect is just the opposite, as with little children who grow up in abusive homes, or soldiers coming back from war, suffering from PTSD. How do you say it's all going to work out for the best to the family member who's just been diagnosed with Alzheimer's? In real life, not every story has a happy ending. Another answer to the question, why do bad things happen, is a belief in a system of future rewards. So Christians believe in heaven, Hindus believe in karma. Though life seems to be unfair now, accounts are going to be squared up later on. And this answer, I think, also has some appeal, because at least in this life, crime usually doesn't pay. Lies have a way of catching up with you. Mischief makers usually come to a bad end. And it's equally true that virtue and integrity carry some built-in rewards. Peace of mind, the recognition of the larger community, the trust and confidence of friends. But whether or not some sweet by and by really exists, that's a matter of faith, not knowledge. All we know for certain is that this world is not always just, or equitable, or even safe, as we know from Dayton and El Paso. One of the classic attempts to address this question of why bad things happen is contained in the book of Job. Job tells the story of a man whose world has turned upside down. It starts with the first two chapters, and these chapters are written in prose. They tell the story of an upright, a righteous man who's living in the land of Uz, wherever that is, who becomes the object of a wager between God and Satan, who decide to test Job, and so they take away everything he has. They take away all his possessions, his family, even his health, in order to measure his loyalty to God. And the final chapter of the book is also written in prose, and it's the conclusion of this morality tale. There Job gets it all back in double measure, twice as many cows, twice as many oxen, twice as many sons and daughters to replace those lost children. All in double measure to what he had before. This prologue and this epilogue, that's one story of Job, and it has the conventional point that goodness gets rewarded in the end. Patient as Job, long-suffering as Job. These are phrases that have entered our vocabulary to convey this message. Don't complain, have trust. Sooner or later, you'll get your due. But the second story of Job is contained in the central part of the book. These are 39 chapters that are not written in prose. They're written in poetry, which suggests they come from a completely different author, and they have a completely different message. Here, the Job who is portrayed is not patient, not long-suffering, not uncomplaining, just the opposite. This is a man who knows he has been wronged. He is shocked, outraged, indignant. He demands that heaven give some accounting, some explanation for all the trouble in his life. I would speak to the Almighty, Job exclaims. I desire to argue my case with God. And onto this scene come Job's three well-meaning but bumbling friends. What do you say to a guy who's lost his family, his home, his possessions, who's sitting on an ash heap, scraping his sores with a broken pot? I know just how you feel. That doesn't seem quite right. It is hard to know what to say to a person who's been struck by tragedy, says Harold Kushner. But it's easier to know what not to say. Anything critical of the mourner, don't take it so hard. Try to hold back your tears. You're upsetting people. That's wrong. Anything that tries to minimize the mourner's pain, it's probably for the best. It could have been a lot worse. She's in a better place now. That's likely to be misguided and unappreciated. Anything that asks the mourner to disguise or reject their own feelings. We have no right to question God. The Lord must have selected you for this special burden because he loves you so much. That's wrong, wrong, wrong. And Job's friends make all these mistakes and more. They're of little comfort to a man who doesn't need advice. He doesn't need criticism. He needs somebody to hold him, not scold him. One of our incurable human tendencies in the face of tragedy is to blame the victim. So the woman who's been raped had to have done something to bring it on herself. For years, doctors told us that if you had ulcers, it was the result of, too much worrying or the wrong personality type or a bad temperament. And then scientists discovered it's not bad thinking, it's bad germs that cause ulcers. But blaming the victim's a form of psychic self-defense, so we can assure ourselves that we're different. We're immune to the afflictions that fall on others. Job reflects that before his troubles began, people listened to me. They kept silence for my counsel, and now I've become their song. I'm a byword. They abhor me. They keep aloof from me. But while Job becomes an outcast among his neighbors, blamed for his own problems, he continues to protest his innocence before God. And then Job gets his wish. For then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind, "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up your loins. I will question you, and you shall declare to me." And I love this line. I love this line because God is not the one who provides the answers. God is the one who asks the questions. Who is with us in those questions? Questions about our purpose, our meaning, our place in this great cosmos. For in a vision, God shows Job the vastness of creation, time and space, the constellations, the planets, the oceans, the earth with its myriad of living creatures. Do you know who put the Pleiades in the sky, or the great bear and his brothers? Do you know who said to the waves, "Thus far shalt thou come, and no farther? Tell me if you have understanding." It took me a long time to get this, what was going on here. Because God never responds to Job's grievances, never responds to Job's requests for logical explanations. God certainly does not apologize yet. Job sits down in the dust, chastened, and repents, which literally means to turn around, to take a completely new direction. He says, I'd heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees. Job has had a perceptual shift, a paradigm change, a conversion experience, because the power behind this life is not ultimately logical or orderly or designed for our personal convenience. It's wild. It's untamed. It's roaring. And the faith that we live by, the faith that gets us through the mad times and the sad times and the bad times, that is not logical either. It is non-rational, non-linear, non-analytical. We don't get it from books or Sunday school lessons or even from TED Talks. You know, it comes to us from someplace beyond, from someplace inexplicable as an act of grace. So what can you do when your world turns upside down? There's some things we can learn from the book of Job. First of all, don't be hard on yourself. Don't blame yourself. Don't engage in self-reproach. Although his so-called friends try to convince Job that he's the source of his own problems, Job maintains his center. He knows that there are some things that are in his control and some things that are not. So when you're down on your luck, try not to get down on yourself.
Hallelujah.
And number two, let your pain be pain. Because there are times when we need to cry. We have to weep. We have to do the hard work of grieving. And Job doesn't try to deny or minimize his suffering. He doesn't mask his anguish. You know, when we study to be ministers, we have to do a chaplaincy work in a hospital. And when I did that, our instructor said, someday you're going to walk into a room where a man has just died. And his wife is going to be crying. She's going to be wailing. She's going to be out of her mind. And the doctors are going to say, give her a shot. She's hysterical. No, don't give her a shot. She doesn't need a shot. She needs someone to be there beside her, to hold her hand, to listen, to simply be present to her pain. On this note, our presidential candidate, Marianne Williamson, talks a lot about our society's tendency to medicalize and pathologize normal human suffering. She says the whole decade of growing up, of our 20s, can be very hard, very tumultuous, but that doesn't mean we're mentally ill. Divorce can be difficult. Losing a loved one, someone who is in a relationship with you leaves you and you're heartbroken. That's very painful, but it's not a mental illness. You have a professional failure. You lose your job. You go bankrupt. That is difficult, but it's not a mental illness, she says. Up until just a few years ago, the American Psychiatric Association did not consider bereavement to be an illness. They had an exemption. If you were widowed, if you were a widower and grieving, you were not in the DSM-6 or whatever edition they're on now, but they changed that protocol a few years ago. Now they say, well, if you're depressed, you need drugs, you need psychopharmacology. And let me be clear about this. I'm not against antidepressants. I'm not against therapy or counseling. They can help tremendously, but they're not cure-alls. And the fact is that you shouldn't be made to feel abnormal or like a failure or sick in the head because you're feeling blue, because that's a normal way to feel. And sometimes there is no way out of the sorrow but through it. You have to go through the sorrow to get to tomorrow. And this brings me to the last point. Open yourself to change. Job is finally answered by God, but it wasn't the answer he was expecting. He's restored, but not like he anticipated. He has a new normal. When our world turns upside down, our first instinct is to push back, to bring back that old familiar world we lost. It's like the little girl who dies and her parents never change the room. They keep all the teddy bears there. Every pink lace curtain stays the same. It's a curated museum, as if that could keep the child alive. But it doesn't work that way. To switch metaphors, really switch them. Life is like riding a motorcycle. If you're on a motorcycle, there's no reverse gear. And one of the funny things is you have to keep moving forward or you fall over. It's true. And the only way to manage all the bumps is to stay loose in the saddle. And the only way to stay on the road is to lean into the curves. You can believe me because I've taken some spills. So is there an answer to the question of why bad things happen to good people? This depends on what we mean by an answer, concludes Harold Kushner. If we mean, is there an explanation that makes sense of it all? Why did the plane crash? Why is there cancer in the world? Then probably no, there's no satisfying answer. We can offer learned explanations, but in the end, when we've covered all the squares on the game board and are feeling very proud of our cleverness, the pain and anguish and sense of unfairness are still there. But the word answer can also mean response as well as explanation. And in that sense, there may be a satisfying answer to the tragedy in our lives. The response would be Job's response: to forgive the world for not being perfect, to forgive God for not making a better world, to reach out to the people around us, and to go on living despite it all. From the poet Mary Oliver, to live in this world you must be able to do three things: to love what is mortal, to hold it against your bones as if your life depended on it, and when the time comes to let it go, to let it go. Amen.